Hi everybody. It is squash season, and if you have ever planted a garden with squash in it, you know that once that squash starts coming out of the garden, it is a lot. And a lot of times it's more than one family can eat, and so you might be eating squash every single day. Probably the most popular way for Oklahomans to eat squash is fried, and it is delicious fried, but we all know that fried foods are not the healthiest for us. So I wanted to show you a healthier squash dish that you could use to help eat some of that squash out of your garden. If you don't have a garden and you want to try this, just keep in mind that your squash that you buy at the grocery store might be shaped a little bit different. They might be a little bit bigger, and so you may not need as many of them. I have squash from a backyard garden grown in Tryon, Oklahoma, and they were pretty small, so I used about 4 of them. But again, if you bought grocery store squash that are a little bigger, maybe you only need 2, 2.5, something like that. I started by washing the squash. Anytime you have store-bought produce or produce right out of your backyard garden, you want to make sure that you give them a rinse in cold water, get all of the dirt off and any other unwanted particles. And then I've sliced them about 1/4 of an inch thick into rounds. I've got my pan heating on the stove here, and I'm going to just heat a little bit of olive oil in it. I first tried this recipe when I was a dietetic intern, and the dietitian at the Serotonin Wellness Center on the OSU campus was doing a healthy foods cooking demonstration, and she made this, and I just thought it was really great, and I've been making it ever since. So I'm going to put my squash down in a single layer into the hot olive oil. I'm just going to sear it on each side. We don't want it to cook to the point of getting mushy, but we do want to get a little bit of color on it. And then I'm going to flip them over and get a little color on the other side as well. So my squash are just lightly browned now, and my pan doesn't hold very many. So I'm going to remove these squash to a platter, and then I'm going to load my skillet up again with the rest of my squash. When I flipped these over, I seasoned them with a little salt and herb blend. You could just use salt and pepper. You could use whatever kind of seasoning blend you like, and just give them a light, just a light little shake over the top with my salt blend. And then we'll just keep going with this squash. So now all my squash is lightly browned, and we're going to move on to the next step. And I want to work really quickly here because I don't want anything to burn at this point. I'm also going to turn my heat down just a little bit. I've had it pretty close to high, like medium high, to get the squash browned. I'm going to sprinkle in some red pepper flakes. If you don't like red pepper flakes, if your family does not tolerate spicy food, just leave this part out. But you just do it to your taste. Be careful, if you don't have the sifter on here, don't just go dumping. Be sure you look. I've learned that the hard way. So I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit in my palm and put it in here. And then I'm going to add my minced garlic. Garlic burns very, very fast, so do not walk away from this. You'll want to put your garlic in. We're going to give it a little bit of a stir in the pan. As soon as you start to smell it, and I smell it, it's time to pour in your liquid so that it doesn't burn. This recipe calls for white wine. Ooh. This recipe calls for dry white wine. Chardonnay works really, really well in this. If you don't want to use wine, that's okay. You could use half lemon juice and half water. That would work really well. You could use chicken broth or vegetable broth. That would work well. I've used dry cooking sherry from the grocery store aisle. If you do want to use the white wine, I recommend using a wine that you like to drink, because it only calls for 1/4 cup, and then you've got the rest of the bottle. So unless you have plans for the rest of that bottle of wine, you're probably going to drink it. And so you want it to be something that you enjoy. So we're just going to let this simmer. I've added all my squash back in with my garlic and my cooking wine and my red pepper flakes, and we're going to let it simmer for just a few minutes. Then we'll put it back on the platter and sprinkle it with feta cheese and chives. When I first tried this recipe, it was made with goat cheese, and that was absolutely delicious. But I couldn't get goat cheese in my rural grocery store. And so feta cheese works really well. Blue cheese would also be really good in this. So this last step doesn't take very long. It just needs to simmer for a couple of minutes. Let that garlic and wine permeate through the squash just a little bit. And we'll put it back on our serving platter here. You want to kind of spread it out, make it look pretty. Cooked squash does get a little bit soft and mushy, and it can kind of fall apart. And so just be careful as you're taking it out so that you don't break it up too much. Now I'll just take my cheese, sprinkle it over the top. You can use as much or as little as you want, really. And then I've got some fresh chives here that I'm also going to sprinkle over the top. The green color just looks really nice, and it'll give it a freshness to the flavor. You could really use any kind of herbs you have handy. Basil or parsley would also be really great on this, or you could do a mix. And there you have it. This is my awesome summer squash.
We hope you enjoyed this video as part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on the OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.